This is going to be short, I hope. I promise that I won't take too much time, but I thought it would be worth introducing the theme of sovereignty or post-sovereignty in the Pacific Islands as a sort of overarching theme under which a lot of the papers fall in one way or the other. When I was talking with fellow Pacific specialists over the last couple of years about what were the key events of the present, obviously everyone thought about the New Caledonia referendum in November last year and the Bougainville referendum, which was supposed to be June this year, but now pushed back at least till October. The themes of sovereignty and post-sovereignty, as people often want to talk about in the Pacific Islands. Thinking about this, of course, there's the famous French philosopher Michel Foucault, much quoted at universities, including this one, who said famously, and this is going back a long way now, theories still continue today to busy themselves with the problem of sovereignty. We need, however, a political philosophy that isn't erected around that problem. We need to chop off the king's head in political theory, as was done in practice, I think he's implying hundreds of years ago. And there are these sort of fashionable ideas of post-sovereignty or shared sovereignty that I'm going to talk about a little bit here today. The Pacific Islands, I think, have often been fertile grounds for these kind of theories, not least because there exist so many small islands or bits of islands that are integrated with the larger Pacific Rim states. Rapa Nui, Easter Island to Chile, Hawaii, Guam and American Samoa to the USA, West Papua to Indonesia, to name but a few. And there exist many others where self-government exists, but forms of free association prevail. The Cook Islands and Niue to New Zealand, for example, Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and Palau to the USA. And in other cases, such as the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas or Tokelau, the association is stronger. I'm not trying to cover all of the cases. Economists have often tried to identify a correlation between lesser political autonomy and higher living standards, not only for these Pacific Islands, but also for all small island states globally, but without necessarily establishing the direction of causation or paying much attention to the politics or historical processes of decolonization. It's plausible, for example, that colonial powers tended to decolonize poorer states and keep control over richer states. Think about the contrast between Hawaii, a US state, and Papua New Guinea, an independent country, for example. Another classic example in our region would be Kiribati, the former Gilbert Islands, which was made independent in 1979, exactly the same year that its phosphate reserves on Banaba Island ran out. And therefore, in its post-independence period, it's certainly struggled economically. Jeff Bertram, formerly a scholar here at Victoria University, has explored these two possible theories for small islands around the globe. Is it the case, he asks, is it the case that the choice of independence or free association leads to a diminution of living standards, or is it the case that the countries that were slightly poorer were the ones that were decolonized and the richer ones were kept with the metropolitan power? And he finds some evidence to suggest that actually the latter was the case, that the richer islands were more likely to remain under metropolitan control. Conversely, a country like Papua New Guinea, with the lowest GDP per capita in the region, well, it might potentially have become another Australian state, but the option was rejected by Canberra. As Donald Denoon writes in his history, the shape of the future came into focus in 1966 when a delegation of Papua New Guinea legislators asked the Australian government if they had a real option to become the 7th Australian state. That may have been just a debating point, but it was not illogical. Free association had been instituted for the Cook Islands, which Caroline's going to talk about later. What made it unthinkable was its timing. White and black Australians were not yet equal citizens at home, and white Australia still informed migration policy. Predictably, the Australian cabinet took fright at 3 million Melanesians crossing the Torres Strait to demand jobs, schools, pensions and other rights of citizens. Instead, they resolved that Papua New Guinea's destiny was independence. So Papua New Guinea becomes an independent country, although I think many in Papua New Guinea would look at that positively rather than negatively. Furthermore, even if it were accurate that island states tend to be better off if they relinquished sovereignty during the decolonization era, that doesn't mean they can do so now. In today's talk, what I want to explore is not whether small island states have an economic interest in trading off independence for higher living standards, but rather how metropolitan powers think about their relationships with island states and how academic specialists have addressed these issues. I'm going to start with three cases. Ramsey in the Solomon Islands, the regional assistance mission to the Solomon Islands, which lasted from 2003 till 2017. We're about to have the first post-Ramsey election in April, just a month or two, which has been referred to by some as a canonical example of a shared sovereignty. After travelling to the country on a World Bank-funded visit in 2008, the famous public intellectual Francis Fukuyama, he of End of History fame, said that the sharing of responsibility for sovereign functions is largely accepted. The Economist ran an article about the Solomon Islands and as a path-breaking form of what they call G2G, meaning government-to-government delegation agreement. So this is the most radical form of G2G is the delegation agreement, the government of one country providing a public service in another, which in effect cedes part of its sovereignty. In 2003, the government of the Solomon Islands, concerned at rising violence and falling tax revenues caused by corruption, asked Ramsey to arrive and take over law enforcement. Ironically, it's been scholars and consultants most associated with the World Bank, which has the traditional sort of apolitical role, who have been most enthusiastic about the shared sovereignty theories. Often the focus was on the way, what they were thinking about was the way that donor funds were put into a sort of hived off bit of the Solomon Island government budget that wasn't really under the control of local authorities. And sometimes the code word used in Solomon Islands and in the wider literature is co-production of sovereignty. Curious idea. The second example that I want to talk about is from a recent speech by former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who, just in February 2019, who proposed turning Tuvalu, Kiribati and Nauru into what he called constitutional condominiums, which would entail their ceding control over their valuable fishery resources. Needless to say, this went down like a lead balloon in the island states. It was particularly criticised by Eneli Sopoanga, who did what many island leaders do now when they're told that they should be ceding their sovereignty to Australia or New Zealand or whoever, and said, well, what about climate change? And maybe you ought to change your climate change policy. This has become a quite common refrain to get from a lot of the island leaders. Unless we think that Kevin Rudd is just an isolated former Prime Minister who never had a reputation for being particularly concerned about the Pacific, let's remember that actually this kind of thinking has been much more central for Australian foreign policy. In the Australian Foreign Policy White Paper in 2017, there was talk about helping to integrate Pacific countries in the Australian and New Zealand economies and our security institutions. And of course, the PACER Plus negotiations, Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations, have been very much oriented in that kind of direction, as is all the deliberation about a Bikatewa Plus security arrangement that's been talked about at the last Pacific Island Forums. I think it's on the agenda for the next one as well. And let's remember that Australia signed a new security treaty recently with the Solomon Islands. Michael and Anna Powell certainly interpret this as a kind of recolonization or recolonization bid. I won't go into that, but you can see what they say quoted there. And let's also remember that other people like Greg Colton at the Lowy Institute have been mooting these idea of compact of free association between Australia, Tuvalu and Kiribati, between Australia, Tuvalu, Kiribati and Nauru. Although James Batley, who was the former Special Coordinator of the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands and a former Fiji High Commissioner and a former Deputy Secretary General of AUSAID, says, I think rightly, that providing these countries with a host of government services in exchange for a formal security veto, as Colton is arguing, remains likely to falter on simple grounds of cost alone. And the last example, the third example, French President Emmanuel Macron's idea of creating a sovereignty within a sovereignty for New Caledonia. France would be less beautiful without New Caledonia. And the notions of Islandian sovereignty that we're going to, I think, be talking about over the course of the day. I'm thinking particularly of this paper that Gerald and Yves Lafoy, the former representative of the New Caledonian government here in Wellington, now in Canberra, talked about a unique Islandian concept of sovereignty, where islands that are not sovereign in a Westphalian sense can creatively disassemble and reassemble signifiers of Westphalian sovereignty. And they include the three examples of this: the debate about which flags to fly in New Caledonia, about the putting up overseas diplomatic representatives, and about whether New Caledonia can sign international treaties, which I'm going to come back to. The shared sovereignty theories, a lot of them take inspiration from Stephen Krasner, who was working in the US State Department under President George Bush, and set out to sell shared sovereignty as a legacy initiative for the then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. The type of arrangements which Krasner favoured are neither, they're not things like the League of Nations mandates from the interwar years, or the post-war United Nations trusteeships, or the more recent transitional administrations such as that in East Timor or Kosovo. He doesn't like those. He thinks they have the League of Nations mandates, he thinks they have colonial overtones, and he thinks that the UN trusteeships are not particularly likely to establish well-functioning states. He prefers long-term arrangements that entail a voluntary agreement between recognised national political authorities and an external actor. And it's because the Salomon Islands, as he calls them, entered into a contractual agreement for an indefinite period when it invited Ramsey into the country that Krasner takes this as a textbook case of shared sovereignty. And he says in this passage, actually I'm going to skip that because of time. These ideas, I think, started to become more popular during the era of the Bosnian intervention, the Dayton Peace Accord, with all those internationals being involved in Bosnia, regulating the state, sacking local officials, and all that kind of stuff. Also, of course, Iraq after the 2003 intervention, where there was that short period of US control, East Timor, Kosovo. And one of the notions that came up in this paper in 2005 from the British Overseas Development Institute, called Closing the Sovereignty Gap, was this idea that the consensus now emerging, they said, from global economic, military and political institutions signals that this gap between de jure sovereignty and de facto sovereignty is the key obstacle to ensuring a global security and prosperity. The challenge is to harness the international system behind the goal of enhancing the sovereignty of states. That is, enhancing the capacity of these states to perform the functions that define them as states. Long-term partnerships must be created to prepare and then implement strategies to close this sovereignty gap. A really curious idea when you think about it, because this is actually justifying the intervention, more or less in defiance of sovereignty, as a way of securing sovereignty. The external powers will come in and help you build your sovereignty for you. This is the notion. Classical theories, by contrast, of sovereignty would see a state as sovereign in the sense that it is not subject to any superior external authority in virtue of being an association in terms of law, and because, I think most importantly, the government possesses the authority and procedures to emancipate itself continually from its legal past. And it seems to me that that notion of sovereignty is not so far away from Jean-Marie Chubau's notion of sovereignty being the right to choose one's partners. It is sovereignty that gives us the right and power to negotiate interdependencies. Whereas I think the shared sovereignty theories conflate sovereignty with capacity. Sovereignty becomes a variable capacity for good governance that, in Stephen Krasner's terms, can be unbundled or delegated this way and that way. And I have trouble also with the whole notion of Westphalian sovereignty as so often used by international relations theorists. Ramsay, so the actual empirical stuff here, officially Ramsay neither usurped nor shared nor contravened Solomon Island sovereignty. Unlike the UN missions to Kosovo and East Timor, and this wasn't a UN mission, Ramsay did not assume executive authority, although many foreign commentators, including Stephen Krasner, wrongly thought it had done so. Nor did it displace the indigenous government. It didn't assume portfolios in cabinet or acquire positions at the helm of the ministries. It didn't redesign the constitution or even dismantle the pre-existing police force, despite the latter's complicity in the violence of 1998 to 2003. Immunity provisions were put in place for the arriving police force and security personnel, but these conceded rather than shared legal authority as regards crimes committed by Ramsay officials while on official duties. Ramsay was a mission assembled under the Pacific Island Forum's 2000 Bikatawa Declaration, which required the consent of the Kemakeza government and depended on retention of support from that government. The relevant legislation allowed the Solomon Island government, if it so chose, to give 3 months' notice to end Ramsay. Solomon Islanders certainly did not see themselves as having shared sovereignty, which was in fact one of the factors that provoked the political crisis of 2006-07, which I think Ramsay never quite recovered from, in my analysis, but I haven't time to go into that. The only real cases of shared sovereignty that I see in the Pacific Islands might be the short-lived 1889 to 1899 tripartite condominium in Samoa, although with some uncertainties about that I won't go into. But more certainly, I think the Anglo-French 1906 to 1980 condominium in Vanuatu, which put up separate governments in Port Vila, one on the hill, one in the islands. That I would call a case of shared sovereignty, although we should not forget that the Ni Vanuatu were not citizens under that arrangement. They were effectively stateless. Is the new, and I think I would contest whether what we see in New Caledonia is a case of a textbook case of Islandian sovereignty. I think the verdict that we get from the referendum is that there's an extremely divided notion of sovereignty and a clear correlation that most of the authors that I'm reading find between Kanak support for independence and non-Kanak support for remaining within France. As to the 3 points that seem to signal some evidence of a new kind of Islandian sovereignty, one of the debates was about the flying of flags over public buildings a few years ago, but that was highly contested and highly polarized and split both the Kanak and Loyalist parties in interesting directions and with interesting possibilities for cross-ethnic coalitions. But let's not forget the political context, that it was proposed by Rassemblement UMP's Pierre Progier and supported by the pro-independence Union Caledonian, but opposed by the larger governing loyalist centrist Gomez's Caledonia Ensemble and the pro-independence and leftist FRAENKEL, who preferred a single Caledonian flag. And this caused a lot of controversy that I'm not going to go into today. Secondly, the appointment of diplomatic representatives overseas by territorial governments. Let's remember that they're appointed by the New Caledonian government, if I understand rightly, which, despite collegiality, still operates under majority rule. And, of course, the FLNKS has preferred to send its own representatives overseas, thinking of Daniel Goa, for example, who's been delegated to Australia, and I think here as well. I don't think he's yet been here. And the ability to sign treaties, well, I think the New Caledonian reluctance to sign up to PICTA, the Pacific Island Agreement on Closer Trade, and PESA, which I previously talked about, is really due to high protective tariffs shielding powerful local businesses, often with political links in New Caledonia, from my reading. So lastly, New Caledonia future referendums, because of course that one referendum in November is not the end of the story. 1/3 of the Territorial Congress can call, and already has called, for a further referendum. Just a few words on looking ahead to those contests. I think given the closeness of the 2018 result, one critical, obvious question is whether the prevailing restrictions on the franchise, excluding all those who arrived after 1994, are retained for future referenda. Because if they are retained, and it's politically difficult to avoid that, you would have thought it's only a matter of time before the pro-independence side gets a majority. But another critical question on the other side is whether pro-independence voters might settle for something less than independence, such as free association, which certainly some of the major parties seem to be supporting. Over the weekend, I'm editing a special collection of the Journal of Pacific History on New Caledonia. We've got some great papers from Nick McClellan, Denise Fisher, and Matthias Schoscher. Have I pronounced that correctly? Schoscher? Hot cat, I think you call it. And he says far from there being an agreement on a unique form of Islandian sovereignty, he says after 30 years of dialogue about decolonization have not succeeded in reaching an agreement on a consensual future. And he quotes Alan Klisnach, the member of the Council of State and co-writer of the Nouméa Accord, who describes the current situation as two trains proceeding along a single track. I think compromise is unlikely to be reached by a few concessions on the signifiers of Westphalian sovereignty. And, okay, I'll drop the last two slides. Well, they were just sort of funny anecdotal things, really, that are just sort of silly little footnotes on blurred sovereignty, which I couldn't help resist but look back at all the antics about British colonisation of India, Ceylon and Pakistan, where in the early days they commenced independence as realms within the British Commonwealth with dominion status, which was a method of preserving British influence. For India, that was a temporary step to placate the British before establishing a republic. For Pakistan, a safety mechanism to deal with Indian hegemony. But what interests me about this is the way that the British saw it. I think you called me a British nationalist before, and now I'm going to demonstrate that I'm not. Because Ernest Bevin, the British Secretary of State for the time, said, "I do not like repetition of the word independence the whole time. There is quite a different meaning attached to this by the Eastern people from ours." Right. A very curious notion. They preferred the notion of a sort of blurred notion of a fully responsible status within the British Commonwealth. And Churchill also said, well, you know, they can't probably be independent while they're still swearing the oath of allegiance to the British Crown. That's just a footnote. I'll stop there. Thanks.